Okay, so the hinge year, I think the most important hinge year between 1945 and 2001 was the year 1968. So before I talk about, make my case for 1968, let me talk about Rebeck and Wasserstrom's definition of a hinge year. Excuse me. So they define a hinge year as a year that resounded down the ages, dividing chronology into before and after. A year where we can say one era ended and another was born, and they go on to say that basically hinge years are typically defined by single acts, or characterized with reference to a single act, a single date, even a single emblematic image. So that's basically a hinge year. So I'm going to start by uh, admitting that 1989 probably fits more precisely into Rebeck and Wasserstrom's exact definition of a quote hinge year. However, I would argue that 1968 and the late 60s more generally is indeed or was indeed a year in which one era ended and another was born. So I think you could make the case that 1968 is as much of a hinge year as 1989, if not more so. So let me try and make that case. So I would say the racial, gender, sexual, moral, consumer, military, environmental status quos went from being relatively challenged before relatively unchallenged before 1968 to being very much in question globally after 1968. And of course, this year was, it was obviously a movement year as well. I think it's a little more obviously a movement year than maybe a hinge year. But I think, relegating it to the status of just a movement year sells it short fundamentally, because it wasn't just a distinctive struggle for change, but it actually amounted to a very successful challenge to the social, political, and economic norms that came before it. And I should point out as well, there are distinctive movements and images that are associated with 1968, just like there are with 1989. So we have, for example, the chaos and protests at the Democratic National Convention. We have the assassinations of Martin Luther King and RFK Jr. That kind of represent the upheaval and chaos of the era. We have the Black Power salute by Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. So 1968, it has its iconic, events and images to go along with it. So let's get to specific aspects of this question. So first of all, what was the historical narrative that was changed in 1968? So I think you could make the case that the historical narrative of the inevitability of white patriarchy, materialism, traditionalism, whether that's referring to traditional values, or respect for institutions, especially long-standing institutions, global inequality, environmental devastation, all of these different aspects of the status quo were significantly challenged in 1968. Now, the status quo didn't shrink from the fight, they struck back. It struck back with the election of Nixon in 1968, coincidentally. But also the elections of Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, right? Thatcher in England, of course. We also have consumerism striking back. So the, ubiquitous symbol of the spirit of the late 60s, revolutionary late 60s, first thing I think of is Che Guevara, right? Che Guevara, very quickly after the late 60s, becomes as much of a capitalist commodity as Coca-Cola or Nike. Colonialism continues the legacy of colonialism to a large extent, at least economically, as Dr. Barnes pointed out in one of his lectures. So those are, conservative forces that are fighting against what happened in 1968. But I would argue that the ferocity with which the conservative interests and movements struck back is very much a testament to the strength of the progressive challenge of 1968. Now, what historical narrative replaced whatever came before 1968? So I think this is a little bit hard to put your finger on, but I would say after 1968, it became a dogfight between the forces of radical change on the one hand and the forces of traditionalism and the status quo on the other hand. And that's essentially where we are today. So I think the status quo was unchallenged, and then it was challenged. Before 1968, it was unchallenged. After 1968 and the late 60s more generally, again, it was a dogfight. And I think that's still, playing out. We don't know how that story ends. But I think from the vantage point of 2020, it's much more clear that The main legacy, the indisputable legacy at this point of the late 60s and 1968 in particular, is anti-institutionalism and anti-elitism. So I think we see iterations of this on the right and on the left. People are distrustful, not just in the West, but in every corner of the globe, really. People are increasingly distrustful of elites, distrustful of institutions. Social trust is at like an all-time low. And I think that's very much a legacy of the 60s. And you could argue that's what replaced, that's the narrative. That's the mindset that replaced whatever came before 1968. I was also going to point out, I thought this was interesting. So Smith, the Smith text on page 1025, talks about the women's movement beginning in feminism, second wave feminism in the United States, beginning with The Feminine Mystique, by a book published by Betty Friedan in 1963, and that kind of launches the feminist movement in the West and in the U.S. in particular, or second wave feminism. But it's more international than people typically think. So as Smith points out, after the Vietnam War, women in Chile and other Latin American countries lobbied successfully for the vote. Well, in India, women persuaded the government to take action to improve job prospects and remedy a range of abuses. In Catholic Italy, feminists won the right to divorce, to gain access to birth control information and to obtain legal abortions. Okay, so I think another way to think about the power of 1968 is, if you think about a contemporary movement or cause, like Black Lives Matter, like the global fight against climate change, spearheaded by someone like Greta Thunberg, right? It's really impossible to imagine those movements without the late 60s and 1968, especially. Would those movements exist? If they did exist, what form would they take? What would characterize them? It's really impossible to say. They necessarily go through the prism of 1968. In a similar way, you can make the same case about 1989 as Rebeck and Wasserstrom do. So they point out that, the famous Beijing tank man image from Tiananmen Square in 1989 was, an antecedent of that was a similar image from the 1968 Prague Spring. So in conclusion, I would say 1968 is the real hinge year. Hopefully I've made a good case for that, and thanks for listening.